Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello again. Here's part 2 of a conversation with Joe Recinos. Hope you enjoy hearing from him and learning from him as much as I do. We'll see you next week.
So in La Perla, we came out with this report, and we issued a series of different recommendations to be applied. But it was very difficult to have follow-up because you need resources, you need funding to do it, and it was very difficult. I would do it if I was able, but it's unfortunate. We didn't have the economic resources to continue to push have these resources introduced.
But we still have some models in the corporate structure down there that are surviving and thriving, right?
Yes, I mean through this the Solidarity movement, you have 2,700 companies in Costa Rica. It's over 500,000 workers. I mean, Costa Rica is a small country, so that's a significant amount of the labor force. And many of these associations, the associations own block of stock in the parent corporations. It gives us a platform. Now, in Guatemala, we're doing the same thing. It's a smaller number of companies. And in Guatemala, we're setting up wholly employee-owned firms that sell a product or a service to the parent corporation, like a trucking company, and then they rent out the services to the parent corporation. It's difficult in Guatemala to get corporations to sell shares to their own employees. Much easier in Costa Rica to do so. There's a different paradigm, a different mindset. In all of Latin America, you need to understand, even in Mexico, most of the large companies and most of the companies are family owned. Very few companies that are publicly traded. The other type of companies are multinational corporations and may have subsidiaries.
Right.
So in terms of applying Broaden capital ownership principles, it would be much easier in doing it with new companies. But if we're trying to get some of these large corporations that are family owned, it's much more difficult. Now, in Costa Rica, it's actually much easier. People understand about power and about ownership. You don't have the divide between the very wealthy and the very poor.
Well, you also have the public banks there that have been successful, right?
Well, you have when the revolution of 1948 took place in Costa Rica, at which time they abolished the army. The army, Costa Rica does not have an army. It was abolished in 1948. You have a police force, but
right.
Rather unique situation.
Yeah.
Arthur Martin, who was the founder of Solidarismo, was Minister of Economy in the new government under Jose Figueres, and he nationalized the banks. People accuse him of wanting to promote socialism. That wasn't his idea. His idea was to take the banks that were taken over by the new government and then sell them to the citizenry at large. So you'd have many shareholders. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And then in the 1980s, the government of Costa Rica allowed private banks to operate. So you have 29 private banks and credit co-ops, consumer co-ops that provide credit. But apart from those 29, which include private banks, the government held on to the 4 major banks in Costa Rica. And people in Costa Rica still support them. And each of these public banks compete with the others. So, the people of the IMF and others have always criticized the government of Costa Rica for maintaining the ownership in control of these 4 public banks. That apparently they work reasonably well. They have a significant amount of the savings of people in these banks, as opposed to a number of the private banks over the last 60 years having gone bankrupt. So yes, it's interesting to see these existing public banks, and it would be far more interesting to follow through on Alberto Martin's original thought as the Minister of Economy under Figueres, to have these banks become owned by the citizenry at large. It could dovetail into the concept of broadened capital ownership that hopefully someday we will be able to introduce into Costa Rica.
Right. If we had a leader who was interested in furthering the legacy of Martin and, creating an ownership situation where the citizens owned the bank and had it set up so that the central bank created credit vouchers basically for the citizens to invest in dividend paying corporations, then it just seems like that wouldn't be so hard to do, because they're sort of on the track in that direction almost. What do you think are the odds of finding an advocate there?
Well, you need someone there to do it. I spent 15 years really going back and forth between Guatemala and Costa Rica, and I simply can't do that any longer.
Right.
We need funding. Even if we have some people in Costa Rica, they need funding. It's just not going to happen without people dedicating a significant amount of their time to do it. So at some time in the future, hopefully, we will be able to interest some business leaders in Costa Rica in our ideas. And I'm still working on the idea of, through the Solidarity movement in Costa Rica and here, and even here in Guatemala, to spread these concepts of broadened capital ownership. Because Solidarismo is accepted by the private sector in Costa Rica and in Guatemala. In Costa Rica, it's much more advanced. The companies agree to sell equity to these associations. We don't apply the leveraging that you acquire under binary economics. The central bank is not involved. In Guatemala, we're still pushing the idea of equity for the employees, trying to overcome suspicions. And there's a fundamental suspicion in all of Latin America that there are those who own and those who should not own. Okay, you can own your own home, but there are some concepts in people's minds. It has a lot to do with education. Costa Rica has a literacy rate of 98%. In Guatemala, it's 55 to 60%, which means 45% of the population in Guatemala do not read or write. It's an agrarian Indian culture. So there are people, some have some legitimate concerns that they say to themselves, well, yes, you can give people the political vote, but you don't want to really turn over control of the economy to people who can't read or write. You don't know what's going to happen. Now, there are also, unfortunately, there are people in Latin America, even in the United States, who simply do not believe that the majority of the people should have the right to own.
Right. Well, that goes along with what you were saying earlier about the elite. There's people who think that they are better than other people everywhere. That's what's holding us up.
Yes, and it doesn't exist just on the right; it's on the left as well. People who advocate socialist ideas are in the same category of people on the far right. Fascism is a circle; it comes back. You have fascists on the far right who believe in authoritarian regimes, and you have fascists on the far left who believe that the government should control and own. But of course, who's going to run the government? Well, the people who know better, the people who know really how society ought to be organized. So we have to be very careful that and understand it's a circle. Okay, that fascism exists on the far left as it exists on the far right. And you both far extremists are advocating authoritarian regimes. That's the opposition that we run into. Now, what do we do in Latin America? We try to divide. We try to find those people, for example, in the private sector that are progressive, that who are looking for new solutions, and understand the concept of power, and that they have to take the leap of faith to allow, for example, their employees to acquire equity and vote their shares. And there are people like that.
I know you've worked directly with leaders in many countries. Is there any particular story about doing so that you would like to share?
Well, some of the leaders that I've worked with, and also with Norman Kurland, well, Alberto Martin, for example, whom we just spoke about with the Solidarismo.
Right.
Another individual who died a few years ago, his name is Lorenzo Cervije. He's a Spaniard. He's the owner of the largest, his family is the owner of the largest bread manufacturing multinational company in Latin America called Bimbo. And when I first met him in the 80s, he said that as a corporate policy, he was forming worker associations in each of these 50 subsidiaries, and that they would acquire 10% of the equity of the parent corporation, and that he eventually wanted the workers to own 45% of the shares of each of the subsidiaries. Now, understand, this is a family-owned company.
Right.
So for him to talk about 45% of the shares owned by the workers is significant.
Yes.
And he worked with Norman Kurland and I through a contract with the Inter-American Development Bank and a very prestigious university in Mexico called ITAM to develop legislation to introduce broaden capital ownership in Mexico. This is 1992. And we came up with a series of recommendations, legislative recommendations, so we could begin to apply employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, as a national alternative. Unfortunately, we didn't get the legislation through. This is 1992, but we still have the documents. So it's a question of getting to the new governor of Mexico, even though he's more socialist inclined. It could be an opportunity to introduce these concepts. So it'd be well worth. I had to think of a way of doing this, of getting back into Mexico to see if we can get the original concepts that we worked out in part with this individual Lorenzo Cervije, one of the most prominent progressive Mexican business leaders that I had ever met. That's one person. Another person whom I met in the 1970s was a former mayor of Guatemala. His name was Colom Argueta. And I had spoken to him about applying broad capital ownership concepts in redoing some of the slum areas in Guatemala City. So with the idea at that time, we're going to set up what we then called a community investment corporation, which all the citizens, the people, the residents of this impoverished area whose homes were on the sides of cliffs in Guatemala City would become the shareholders. And this community investment corporation, in turn, would promote broadened capital ownership, inviting industry into the area, building condominiums that you would then lease out so that the new employees plus the residents would actually own the real estate and own the new capital structures through this community investment corporation. Very far-reaching individual. Unfortunately, he tried a year later to set up his own political party, and he was assassinated as being a communist. And he was certainly not a communist. He was what we would call today a social democrat, which is someone similar in economic thought to Obama. But he believed in the idea of broadened capital ownership. So he was also an individual whom who I admired. He risked his life to try to apply these concepts. The other group, one of the largest private banks in Mexico, the Banco Nacional de Mexico, did an internal study, which I had helped instigate, to whether the employees ought to acquire equity and set up a type of an ESOP so that the employees would own a significant amount of the equity, but 30, 40% of the equity. And afterward, I met with the principal owner, because it's a family-owned bank. His name was Agustin Legoria, about the idea. And he said he had reduced the concept, the idea, the original proposal, so only top management would acquire equity. And I told him, you're playing with fire. At some time in the future, a future government is going to expropriate your bank. And he sort of smirked and said it'll never happen in Mexico. A year later, the new president of Mexico, his name was Madrid, came in, and one Sunday, he expropriated all the private banks in Mexico.
Wow.
So he had to buy back the bank later on from the government. Fortunately, now the Banco Nacional de Mexico has a type of employee ownership program. So the employees, not just the top elite, do have equity. But we could have saved him a lot of money. But that's the kind of elite thinking that goes on. The other group that I admired most was in the 1970s that I worked with, and with Norman Kurland, was the union, the workers' union of United Fruit in Guatemala, called Setufco. They agreed to work with a group from the private sector in Guatemala to buy out United Fruit. And there was a court order in the United States, in Louisiana, to force United Fruit to sell its division in Guatemala in compliance with an anti-monopoly decree that they hadn't complied with for 15 years. So the union joined together with a group of Guatemalan investors, and Norman and I acted as consultants to try to introduce a 100% buyout by the workers, led by the union. The union wouldn't own, but they were pushing the concept so that we'd have what would be very similar to an ESOP in the United States, employee stock ownership plan. Right. And then bananas would be sold to United Fruit. And the idea was to pay off the debt with the future earnings of the sale. Unfortunately, United Fruit didn't like the idea very much. I was followed around by people from United Fruit. When I went and talked to the workers, my life was threatened.
Wow.
Eventually, the buyer who was going to buy out United Fruit, Del Monte, paid $1 million bribe to the then president of Guatemala and his son.
No.
And so that ended our effort. That was my first attempt in 1973 to really try to introduce a concept in Guatemala, going after United Fruit's assets, but in such a way that it would be beneficial to everyone, except that United Fruit had an under-the-table agreement to allow United Fruit access to international markets in pineapple in exchange for allowing Del Monte to acquire the assets of United Fruit, which was counter to the original decree of the Louisiana federal courts. But at any event, and then thereafter, 2 years after that happened, the president of the parent company of United Fruit, United Brands, was accused of bribing government officials in Guatemala and in Honduras, and he committed suicide. He jumped out of the Pan Am building.
Well, this is following a certain theme, don't you think? It seems like everyone who wants more control and more stinginess ends up losing in the end. And that's kind of a theme that I've, found. The more I look at the way things run, you get happy employees if you find a way to make them owners. And instead of, trying to find ways to maybe even give them 10% or something like that. It would seem like some of these people would realize that our model of 100% ownership is so, powerful. They could spin off a subsidiary and say that, it's well, just set it up so that, the employees buy it and they get their money that way, and they could have a contingency in there that by selling it, they have to remain associated with the parent company. I mean, there's ways to do things that everyone shares and still takes advantage of the 100% model. And in the United States, you'd get a huge tax break. You don't pay federal income tax because you set it up as a S corp. This is the way that the theme of what you're telling me is so consistent with what I'm finding everywhere, that this desire to control ends up costing those people in the end.
Let me briefly mention to you one of the efforts I'm involved in right now. I'm helping a Canadian investment bank called APF. They provide traditional investment for equity in different kinds of projects. One of the projects, hopefully, will be a series of mining operations in the border area around Mexico and Guatemala, in gold mining and in zinc and other kinds of products, in which they will come in as a joint investor. They will put up equity, money, cash. But the idea is to organize the communities in the mining areas into cooperatives, and then have the cooperatives have equity and paid for out of the future earnings in these new mining sites. Now, to get there, we have to organize the communities. And one of the reasons that the APF is looking at this as a different model is that the traditional models of mining in Guatemala have led to all sorts of complications. Mining companies will come in, foreign mine companies. For example, the second largest gold and silver mine in the world is located in Guatemala. But the company that owns it owns 100% of the equity. So you have communities complaining. They're open to instigations by the far left Marxists.
Sure.
That mining, in terms of the traditional concepts of exploitation, etc. So APF is looking at this idea that we can have joint investments. Now, we're not talking about 100% ownership of these mining sites by the people in the communities. It's not just the workers. You have very few employees actually compared to the people in communities, because we don't have legislation. We don't have central bank financing. But this group is willing to come in as a joint investor. So these communities will have a significant amount of equity in these new mining sites. So that's one of the examples, one of the things I'm looking at and working with, trying to continue our efforts in Guatemala.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
So
moving towards more ownership is always good.
Yes, and then you build platforms. So then you're able to go to the next stage. Okay, it's very difficult to propose broadened capital ownership as a national priority, as a constitutional obligation. Now, in Costa Rica, I think we could go a long way in doing that. We came very close on different times. And if we could find some people in Costa Rica who really like these ideas and got the private sector to support it, that's where I would go. Mexico, again, I mentioned, because of the new left to center government. It's okay that they're moderately left to center. It may give us the opening that we need, because the new president, López Obrador, is going to run into problems. You can't apply socialist ideas get away with it for long.
Right.
So he's going to run into problems, and I think we could solve it for him. So Mexico would be another place again, and we could build on all the studies that we did over the years and the contacts. Apart from Costa Rica, the other countries in Latin America that I would look at are Argentina and Chile, in large part because of the high levels of education. In each country, you're talking about 90% of the population as being well educated.
Okay.
Middle class societies. And they keep making mistakes, particularly Argentina, of applying socialist ideas. The current president of Argentina is moderately right of center, Macri. But he doesn't know about our concepts. Now we have some people in Argentina who support our concepts, but again, we need to find sources of money so that we can go ahead and promote them. I used to go back and forth by bus from Guatemala to Mexico City. It was a 24-hour ride.
Wow.
So I go every 2 months, every 3 months, and stay in inexpensive hotels or stay with some people whom I knew. That was in the 1970s and 80s.
Well, you have obviously,
very hard.
devoted your life to this work.
Well, we continue to do our best. Some of the ideas I wanted to mention, though, is people who get involved with us have to understand that, yes, we should continue to work with enthusiasm so that we can try to get to key leaders. Very important. For every 10 people you talk to, maybe you're going to find one key leader. And the key leader is someone who, in half an hour, he or she understands what you're talking about.
Right.
And that's the question, what do you want me to do about it? That happened in a meeting with Russell Long and Louis Kelso and Norm Kurland, 1974, I believe. And Norman thought that Russell Long would be opposed. Why? Because his father was Huey Long. Because Russell Long represented oil interests. But when they finally met with him, and Louis and Norman explained what we wanted, Russell Long said, I don't care who's right. I care what's right. And this is right. What do you want me to do about it? Norman fortunately had a draft legislation that he and Louis are trying to get through Congress to support employee stock ownership plans. And based on that meeting, about 20 different pieces of legislation came about. So those are the kind of people you have to go after. And again, I'm saying this as a gauge. People who understand, they may not understand all the subtleties, but they understand the concept. They understand where you're going. They'll do so in a half an hour, an hour. So so for those of people who are associated and are members of CESJ, should keep that in mind. That when you're going to talk to 10 people, don't be overly frustrated. Maybe you're going to find that one golden person, but that's the person you need to work with. 2, the other point is, yes, we need to act as if this concept can continually be applied. If we find the right person, yes, it could take off. We could apply binary broad capital ownership in the United States within 5 years, if you had the right people and you had the right amount of resources. But it also may take 10 or 20 years more to do it. I first met Norman Kurland 50 years ago, and I thought this whole concept. Surely people would like this concept, but then you find out that you have people like this fellow Stuart Mott, the heir of the GM fortune. At least he was honest about it. He liked to have power, and he certainly didn't want other people to have it.
Right.
But you have people who are very subtle in opposing the concept. And you have to understand where they're coming from, too, and try to
Right.
peel off their supporters. So, need to be involved for the long term, but you have to keep trying to apply the concepts in the short term. And you need to seek out those leaders in all sorts of professions who believe in the concept. And it takes
It's
time.
funny you should mention that, because I was going to say to you that one of the, I guess, fields that we really need to be working more in is technology, because if we can't get something like capital homesteading in place to, fix the frivolous debt-based money system that creates booms and busts, we might have to construct our own system to replace it when it fails and collapses, And so it may be that I was thinking if we could get someone in Costa Rica who is a programmer to come up with, a blockchain-based capital homesteading banking system where people just use their phones. I mean, they're already thinking in that way there, just an idea. Just, you never know when something like that is going to happen. And you're right, it's people in every field, and you don't know which field it's going to come from, but I believe it will happen.
Correct. We have to be careful with talking about bitcoins and the view of many people. I would surmise in the United States, that certainly in Latin America, it's a type of Ponzi scheme. You need to educate people of what we're talking about.
Right. It would have to be very specific. The programmers that set it up would have to be totally, versed in how just third way system would work.
It's not just being versed. Just the concept itself. You talk about bitcoins in Guatemala, people say, get away from me, because
Right.
and I heard one of the foremost experts on bitcoins and blockchain. She said that, and she's one of the experts. She says the world is not ready for it. People have misconceptions, and we have to be very careful that people understand what we're talking about. And we have to be very careful that we know what we're talking about. And this is I've forgotten her name, but she's one of the foremost experts. I just mentioned that as a caveat. And linking it to broadened ownership, we have to be very careful about what we're talking about and understand there are misconceptions, and some of them probably are justified, that say this is a type of Ponzi scheme. This is a way to rob my money. I mention that because I know people in Guatemala who advocate this as well, but I don't think we're there yet.
That's a good point. It may be 20 or 30 years down the road, but that may be eventually a way to create our own system to replace the one that the controllers won't let go of.
Correct. I think it'd be lesser than that. It may be 5 or 7 years. I don't think it'll be as long as you think. I don't think it'll be 10 or 20, but it's still easier to convince in the United States the Federal Reserve to change its monetary policy, and the way you do it are with examples. You tell the Federal Reserve, let's use your discount window to finance a particular company. So this particular company can then go through its private bank and use the discount window to acquire a new line of credit. That way, you don't run into the opposition of traditional economists who say this is going to be inflationary or you're printing money. Now, there are arguments to counter traditional economists, particularly Keynesians, who will vehemently disagree with what we're trying to do, and also free market economists. So Louis Kelso was opposed by people like Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson. And of course, you have traditional Keynesians and so-called free market economists who are absolutely opposed to what we're trying to do. But I think if we applied it on a specific case, could be a community, or it could be 2 or 3 different companies who acquire financing using central bank discount, leveraging through the discount window. So going to one of the Federal Reserves, of course, if we can get the model set up so that the loans are repaid and tied into insurance, as an example, that might go a long way in setting the stage so that we could look at how this could be introduced as national policy in the future.
That's true. That's great. Great idea.
The understanding that traditional economists are going to oppose us. So we have to rethink, we have to re-educate many of the traditional economists. As Louis Kelso said once in an interview with Mike Wallace, and this is printed out, Norm has that, it was printed out in CSJ. It was a televised interview.
Right.
So you can actually see it. It was on CBS with Mike Wallace, who interviewed Louis Kelso. There's a take of Paul Samuelson saying, because when Mike Wallace said that Russell Long supported it, Samuelson looked surprised and said, well, I certainly hope he changes his mind. It's disturbing that someone like that Russell Long would support an idea like this. And then it cut back to Louis Kelso, and Louis and Mike Wallace asked him, and what do you think about Paul Samuelson's views? Because Kelso had been in touch with Matt Samuelson before, of course. He says, well, if it comes down to a traditional economist promoting a new idea or saving his own face, he won't make a mistake. He'll save his own face.
That's right. And I think he said that he was kind of like Pasteur to the doctors, that Pasteur was a chemist and the doctors said he was nuts. But it turns out he had to have someone to come in from the outside of the system to realize what was wrong.
Yes. It's sort of a Eureka moment. So that was my Eureka moment when I met Norm Kurland and Louis Kelso in 1968, 1969.
Yeah, I'll never forget my Eureka moment when I was reading William Greider book Secrets of the Temple, and it mentioned Kelso, and I immediately went on the internet and started reading what he had to say, and it was just so obvious. I'm like you. I can't believe so many other people don't just automatically say, hey, that's the way, but hey, if we can get 1 in 10, then we can make something happen. So we just have to find that 1 in 10.
So how did you get in touch with Norm Kurland afterward? How did you pursue?
I just, was looking around on the internet and I realized that CESJ was the only people that were still promoting the ideas, and started emailing them and, asking questions, and found out how to get involved and just started getting involved. So,
very good.
Yeah. Now I'm honored to be working side by side with the great Joe Recinos.
It's a group effort. I understand that. We all do our part.
Well, it is. But we need more people who have, credibility, and you certainly do. I hate to see people like on the Wikipedia page, they say this is a fringe idea, but there's more people like you who are educated in economics who will stand up and endorse this idea than any who will stand up and endorse the exact model that we have right now. They all say Keynes was wrong and we should be doing this, or we should be doing this differently, or so.
There are a few economists. Norman Bailey is an economist. One of the things that I'm hopeful about is with all this social media and the contacts, whom I'm not an expert in, really. I mean, that's I grew up with the typewriter and the mimeograph machine,
right?
And, when IBM introduced the ball for the IBM Selectra typewriters, I and others thought that was the miracle of the ages.
Right.
And the fax machine, my God, absolutely tremendous.
Yep.
But, I admire young people, but what we need is to harness their knowledge to help make this paradigm jump into getting the message out in different ways.
That's right.
I know we're trying to do that through CESJ's apprentice program. We bring in students to work over the summer and do work. but it's hard to follow up. I mean, people have to make a living, and it's difficult. So we need
Well,
to
we're
all.
making a lot of progress on social media, and I can say really the person that's doing the most in that regard is Gary Reber, and there's now thousands of people reading his stuff. Really, I really appreciate your time today and sharing with our listeners your wisdom, and I pray for your continued health and success in spreading our concepts in Central America. And just let me know if there's any way that I can help you, Joe.
Okay, very good. And thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
You bet. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joe. Okay. You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year. And also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.